I'm going to talk to you about how to do research for an annotated bibliography or a paper. So you may have an assignment in your class that is an annotated bibliography or a paper that requires you to do outside research. So in these cases, what your professor is generally looking for is a source that is credible and oftentimes peer-reviewed. The difference between a peer-reviewed source and a not peer-reviewed source is that a source that has not been peer-reviewed is one like a YouTube video or a blog post or a website. Generally with these things, anybody can create a website or a blog post or a YouTube video, right? And so it doesn't necessarily mean that the information that they are providing here is correct or factual or high quality information. And so they aren't generally considered to be super credible sources. That doesn't mean that you can never use them. There are ways that you can use any source, but you do want to keep in mind that if you are using a source like that, that you need to do a lot of research into the person to figure out, do they have any biases? What is their expertise level on this particular topic? Things like that to make sure that the source that you're using is credible. Again, though, generally you're going to be asked to use sources that are peer-reviewed. And a peer-reviewed source is one that has gone through a process where other experts in the field or an editor or someone has looked at this source and given it the thumbs up and said, yes, this is a good quality, credible, factual article. This isn't to say that they never make mistakes. There are retractions and corrections in newspapers fairly frequently, but that is actually a sign of credibility. A non-credible source will not do a retraction or a correction when they're proving wrong, whereas a high quality credible source will. After all, the writers, the researchers, everyone involved in this process is only human, so they do tend to make mistakes. But in general, these sources will be ones that have fewer factual errors or outright lies or things like that in them. Now, one way to gather your sources is to use a program like Zotero. So there is a link for Zotero in the module potentially, and your professor may require you to use it or may not. It's just going to depend on the professor. But regardless of if there's a link or a requirement to use it or not, this is a really great resource for you to use to keep track of your research. So you can install it as an extension on your browser, and that will allow you to kind of automatically have these papers input into this list for yourself. And when you do that, you can do notes on them, you can tag them so you can kind of organize them more easily. There are a lot of different things that you can do with this. It will also provide you with this drop-down menu, which will allow you to choose a citation style. At KCC, it's most often going to be American Psychological Association 7th edition, unless they update to the 8th edition, but you're always pretty much going to use APA at KCC. So this will give you the correct formatting and citation for the article that you're looking at. This is really useful, particularly if you have a lot of sources that you're using. For instance, I've written papers that have used well over 10 sources, and that can make it difficult sometimes to keep track of all of those sources. And this is a really nice and easy way for you to be able to do that and to be able to return to the source at a later time if you need to, right? So you can just double click on it and it's going to take you back to the source that you were looking at, right? So this is a really easy way to keep track of your sources as you're doing a research project or an annotated bibliography of some kind. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to look at is you will want to utilize your library. This is a particularly important source for you to use. And so with this source, what you are going to want to do is probably go to find an article or databases. So you can also use the library to find books, obviously, but most likely you're probably going to be looking at articles. So you'll click on this and it's going to take you to a wide variety of different articles, and you can see under them that they all have different sorts of topics and things that you can look at under them. Oftentimes EBSCO is going to be a really great resource for a variety of sources. So we'll just go ahead and look at that one. Click through. And you can see all of the different kinds of sources that you can choose from. These are basically all the different things that it will search through in order to find the information for you. We'll just go ahead and select all for now. And then let's say that we are looking for advertising strategies. Advertising strategies or marketing strategies. Now, the or is really important here. The way that EBSCO searching works is very different from the way that Google searching works because they use Boolean search terms in EBSCO. So you know that when you go to Google, you can kind of type in any sentence or like half a sentence and it's going to give you probably what you want. When you're searching an academic database using Boolean search terms like or, and, but, like those kinds of things are going to be really helpful and you have to really use the correct words. So oftentimes when I've been researching, if I haven't been able to find the thing I want the first set of words, I will keep rephrasing things until I find the set of words that's going to give me exactly what I want. So sometimes it takes a little bit of practice to figure out what kinds of words you want to use. You can also use the advanced search, and this will bring up the Boolean search terms, the and or not. So ends means you want advertising strategies, and also another thing at the same time, or means advertising strategies or marketing strategies, but not both. And then not means advertising strategies, but not advertising strategies that include whatever word that you don't want included within advertising strategies, right? And so you can find things from a certain time period, which can also be important. A lot of times you don't want sources that are older than about a decade, but it's going to depend on the topic that you're researching, right? So if you're looking at advertising strategies in the 1980s, obviously that's going to really change your search. Whereas if you're looking at current technology, you probably don't want sources that are older than maybe a year or two because technology tends to move so fast, right? So you really want to keep in mind for the project that you're working on, what is the best date range for you to use? You can also choose the kinds of publications, languages, all sorts of different things. There are quite a few options here, right? So in this advanced search, there are a lot of different things that you can use to limit your search. So what you'll do then is you can scroll down, you can look for things that seem like they might be relevant. Again, if you scroll through a few pages and nothing is relevant, that's probably when you are going to want to change what you have written. So something like advertising and ethos or something like that, right? And then it's going to bring up any kind of articles that have both advertising and ethos in them. And so that is how you can find articles like that, right? Now, another thing to think about here when you're doing your research is how narrow of a scope or how broad of a scope you want for your research. You can do historical research to provide context for a time or a particular subject, or you can go get really specific and say, if we're looking at, advertising analysis and doing an analysis on Dior advertisements, oftentimes students will specifically only look for advertisements or articles that are talking about advertising for Dior. And that's actually probably a bit too specific, especially if you need 5, 6, 7 sources. There are probably not going to be that many sources that are going to give you what you need. What you want to do, and this is why it's a good idea to do your observations and analysis first, is that then you can look at, well, what kind of an audience did it seem like they were marketing towards? And if you think, oh, well, they were marketing towards men in this particular advertisement, then you can look at advertising and marketing to men, right? And find things like that. And then what you'll do is you'll extrapolate from that information and say, okay, well, even though this article isn't specifically talking about Dior, a lot of the strategies that they talk about in the article, I have seen in the advertisement that I'm looking at. And so you say, like, well, in this article, Smith says that, one strategy of marketing to this group of people is X. And I noticed X showing up again and again in the Dior advertisement, right? So you want to make sure that you're not limiting your search so much by only looking for things that pertain exactly to the exact thing that you're talking about, because that could be really limiting on your research. So that is how you would use the library database. You'll need to log into it first, but it's a really, really great way to find peer-reviewed articles, which is going to be the best kind of sources for you to use in your papers. Now, the next one is going to be Wikipedia. A lot of students have different ideas about Wikipedia, either that they should never ever use Wikipedia or that they're being gatekept from using Wikipedia. Neither one of these is exactly correct. So Wikipedia is actually a much more credible source than most people give it credit for. It generally has pretty good accurate information, and it's a really great way to start doing research for your paper, because you can get a broad background kind of idea of what's going on. But more importantly, if you find something interesting, like you're saying Egyptians used papyrus to make sales messages and wall posters, and you're like, well, that's really interesting, I want to look into that, you can click on the little citation and it will take you down to it where you can find the actual article, right? And so this is a great way to find articles that you would be able to use in your final paper. Now, the reason that you can't use Wikipedia in your final paper has less to do with Wikipedia being Wikipedia and more to do with the fact that in general, you're not going to want to use any encyclopedia resources, even things like Encyclopedia Britannica or anything like that. They aren't great resources for an academic paper, mainly because most academic papers are going to be arguments, and there's not really anything that's providing you information beyond just base knowledge of a topic there, right? So you're not going to learn anything that is something you can really build off of or argue off of. It's just going to provide you background information, a lot of times which doesn't need to even be cited, right? If you're looking into the founding fathers and you were doing a paper about that, and then you ended up finding out that the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776, you do not need to cite that information because that is just general knowledge, right? And that is generally the kind of information that you find in encyclopedias. So what you want to do is you want to look at these kinds of articles that they've used to build up this summary of this particular topic, right? Now, for the final source that we're going to look at is Google Scholar. Now, Google Scholar is a tricky one. It's generally not as good of a resource as the library database, mainly because it will often give you a really wide variety of books and articles. Sometimes you won't have access to the article or the book because it will be behind a paywall or it's something you need to buy. And also because if you look at the dates for these, they're wildly different, and most of them are out of date. Like most of the articles that you will find on Google Scholar are going to be pre-2010 even. And so generally, since you want articles within the last decade, it can be kind of a tricky source in order to find ones. We can, of course, do that anytime. And so we can change this to since 2018. That will help you find more recent articles. But again, you're going to want to make sure that you're typing in a really clear search term, so you can look for something. We can narrow this down a little bit more to like television advertising rate since 2019, and then go to the article. But again, this is where you may run into the problem of you're only going to have access to the abstract, right? And so with that, What you may want to do is if you find an article that you think is one that you would definitely want to use, you may try to research it again in the library database. So if, say, you wanted access to the article, you might go back to EBSCO and then type it in here, right? So that you can find that exact article in a way that you might have access to. So that would just be one of the tricky things about finding things via Google Scholar. And aside from these options that I've shown you, there are a lot of other options for doing research. These are just the main ones. And especially using the library database is going to be a really important one for you. So make sure you do utilize that option. Again, it does take some practice in order to understand the search terms and to find the best ones for your particular paper, but you will also probably find better sources in the long run.